Welcome to Politi-Talk Centered, where we invite you to have the conversation. I'm your host, Sandman.
And I'm your co-host, Holland.
Thank you for joining us today as we discuss Hong Kong's past, present, and future. So, to start off with, I'm going to get as in-depth as I can with the past portion of Hong Kong because I want to paint the picture for how Hong Kong has landed into the position it is today. I feel like that's very important to cover. So for those of you watching on YouTube, if you want to skip to a specific topic in the podcast, I'm going to have timestamp links in the description. As well, the podcast, we're probably going to upload it in 2 parts, depending on how long it goes for. The first part is going to be the past history, and the part 2 is going to be the present day and the controversies over the security law that was passed. So if all you care about is the security law, you can go ahead and skip to that video. And if you don't care about the security video and you're more of a history buff, then this one's for you. But I just wanted to do that to make it a little bit easier for people to get to the content they're most interested in. And also the other thing too is this isn't America. It's Hong Kong. It's another country outside of us. The only thing really that relates to us is trade agreements and stuff. And so this doesn't really affect directly the average American citizen with what's going on in Hong Kong. But I think it's very important that we pay attention to what's going on over there and at minimum learn from the outcomes and the mistakes so that we can apply that to us here to make sure that our freedoms are never infringed on. Or threatened. All right, where it all began. So, way back in the day, it started with the Opium Wars. And basically what the Opium Wars was, the British wanted to conduct trade in the region, but the only real currency that the Chinese recognized was silver. And on top of that, they placed extremely high taxes to foreigners and stuff because they didn't want to exactly trade with them per se, the government at least. So to get around this, the British began trading opium, which was another highly sought item from the Chinese. In return, they would get silk and porcelain. And so that in a way, they were able to kind of circumnavigate the tax, since they were able to do it in bartering, and it really didn't cost them silver. This agitated the Chinese, and they began destroying depots of opium without compensation to the British. And that kicked off the Opium Wars, which were very short-lived. By 1842, the First Opium War ended, and China ceded Hong Kong Island to Britain in an indefinite lease. So they technically would never have to give it back. And by the end of 1898, the Second Opium War ended, and China leased the new territories along with 235 islands to Britain for 99 years. And so that's where this kind of whole area that we know of today as the Hong Kong province and everything, or territory, is defined as it is. That lease defined that area and region. And then we skip forward a little bit, and we go to 1941, and World War II is kicked off, and Japan has taken over Hong Kong. They're occupying it, and with this creates food shortages and horrible living conditions, and basically almost half the population flee to mainland China until the end of World War II. By 1943, and this is a little bit of a long name, but the Sino-British Treaty for Relinquishment of Extraterritorial Rights in China was written. And under that treaty, the British government relinquished any special rights it had in China. This was done as a conciliatory step towards the Chinese government in order to boost up its cooperation with Allied powers. So essentially, it was Britain kind of agreeing to give up their rights in Hong Kong to China so that China would cooperate with the Allied powers, essentially. In 1946, Britain reestablishes the civil governments. This is after the war and everything. And and everything's kind of returning to normal. Hundreds of thousands of former residents return, followed by refugees fleeing the civil war between the nations, between China's nationalists and communists. And then between the 1950s and 60s, starting in the 1950s, there's a huge industrial increase. And because of that, there's a lot of discontent of pay and living conditions, which eventually turned to riots by 1967. And in the late 1960s, living conditions start to improve and social unrest does subside. So you can kind of see that's the first time we see the Hong Kong people acting in demonstration, paving the way for their future of fighting for their rights. By the 1970s, Hong Kong has become the region's economic powerhouse. And later on in the years, by I think it was 1992, it's going to be worth over 25% of China's GDP. So they, for such a small area, it's incredible how quickly they grew in industry and trade. By 1984, Britain and China sign a joint declaration for the conditions that Hong Kong will revert to Chinese rule under the one country, two systems formula. Communist-led China owns Hong Kong, but is allowed to retain its capitalistic economy system and partially democratic political system for 50 years. Now, this is important because this kind of is what we're dealing with today. The idea of this system is based on that declaration. This isn't when it went into effect per se, but it was kind of like in the same way the United States has their Declaration of Independence. This was kind of like their declaration for how their country is going to be established. So this is a very important moment for Hong Kong. Now in 1989, this is probably the most important date to many Hong Kongers. There's a massive massacre of pro-democracy demonstrators in Tiananmen Square, which warrants the introduction of more democratic safeguards. And by 1990, Beijing formally ratifies Hong Kong's post-handover mini-constitution. So there was a very large demonstration for more democracy and freedom in Hong Kong. It was met by extreme aggression and lethality. And I think every year, people in Hong Kong every year celebrate that or commemorate that massacre because it's such a paramount point of their history. By 1992, Chris Patten, who was the last British governor of Hong Kong, will oversee the colony's handoff to mainland China. He announces proposals for democratic reform of Hong Kong's institutions aimed at broadening the voting basis in elections. And the Chinese really don't like that because it threatens dissolving, and they threaten to dissolve business contracts and overturn reforms once they have control. After 2 years of intensive revision and compromise, the Hong Kong legislature introduces a stripped-down version of Patten's reform package, which widens the franchise but very little provision on universal suffrage. And by 1997, the handoff is complete. Now, I'm going to take a moment to kind of explain. So the security law that was passed this year was called Article 23. That article has always been in the Hong Kong law. And this kind of explains into that. So in 2002, proposal for enacting and enforcing anti-subversion law known as Article 23, which would greatly threaten the civil freedoms of the people in Hong Kong, causing considerable controversy. And basically they shelved it. They're like, nobody wants this. It's going to be almost impossible to pass it. So we're just not even going to deal with it. And in 2003, after a visit by a Chinese premier, Wen Jiabao, 500,000 people marched against Article 23, and the bill was withdrawn after it was clear that it would not receive the necessary support from the Legislative Council to be passed, and it was shelved indefinitely, meaning that they're never probably going to consider it again. So take note of that. All right. And I think in this instance, this is one time that Hong Kong kind of shot themselves in the foot. Because had they written it themselves and had it in place, there would not have been the opportunity for China to step in and do it as they did today. So I think that instance was one time that they really should have done something rather than nothing. But I also understand the mindset behind why they didn't. In 2004, China declares that any changes to Hong Kong's elections and their law must be approved through Beijing, giving the communist government right to veto any actions towards more democracy, such as direct elections for the territory's chief executive. In response to this, around 200,000 people protest the Beijing ruling. And there's I want to say it's a British quote, basically said that Britain accuses China of interfering in Hong Kong's constitutional reform process in a manner inconsistent with self-governance guarantees agreed before the handover. So there was a lot of controversy with that. In 2006, tens of thousands of people protest in support of full democracy. And the reason I say that is just there's a very big pattern of every time mainland China does anything negative for Hong Kong, there's a protest. The people stand up for themselves. They fight for their rights. It's never the opposite. The people are never fighting for more. They're never actively going out trying to cause unrest and stuff like that. It's always cause, and the effect is they protest. In 2007, new rules restrict the number of pregnant women from mainland China from traveling to Hong Kong to give birth for Hong Kong residency, an evasion of China's one-child policy. And it's not really heavy hitting with everything that's going on, but I just thought that was interesting. An interesting little tidbit there. That they're even trying to control their people even more, because they were able to kind of escape China to go to Hong Kong like that. And then also in 2007, Donald Tsang is sworn in as the chief executive, and he releases plans for full democracy. And by December of 2007, Beijing states that it will allow the people of Hong Kong to directly elect their own leader in 2017 and legislators by 2020. Chief executive, who was Donald Tsang, hails this, and I quote, a timetable for obtaining universal suffrage. There is much disappointment towards the protracted timescale. So the big issue here is because this is in 2007. So just to be able to elect their own leadership, it's going to be 10 years. And 13 years for their legislators. And make note of what Beijing told Hong Kong, that the people can directly elect their own leadership. Make note of that, because what they do later on is really dirty. In 2008, Hong Kong's pro-democracy camp wins over a third of the seats in legislative elections, retaining key veto over future bills. So that's a very important part as well. 2009, Hong Kong authorities unveil proposals for political reform in response to pressure for more democracy, including a larger legislative council. By 2010, opposition Democratic Party holds first talks with Chinese officials since the 1997 handover, which I think was kind of a double-edged sword. It's good, but it was also bad because it opened up avenues for corruption in Hong Kong's system. By 2014, over 700,000 people take part in an unofficial referendum vote in favor of public influence in shortlisting candidates for the territory's chief executive. Beijing condemns the vote as illegal, and by July, tens of thousands of protesters take part in one of the largest pro-democracy protests in a decade. And by August, Chinese government denies full democracy elections for Hong Kong leader, only allowing candidates approved by Beijing. So, here's where it's kind of interesting. Beijing promised by 2017 that the people will be able to vote vote in their chief executive. And so now China's essentially setting it up to where they'll be like, yeah, you can vote whoever you want as long as we approve of them. Like from this list of people that we say are good. So it's an extremely rigged system. And through September and November, pro-democracy demonstrators occupied the city center for weeks in protest at the Chinese government's stance to limit voters' choice for the 2017 elections. More than 100,000 people took part at the height of the protests. And then in December, authorities take down the protest camp at Mongkok, and make note of this. All right, there's an individual, the officer, and I don't have his name right here, but the individual that was heading these raids, we're going to see his name a lot more. So just remember that there's a certain someone that removed this camp. Okay, so we're up to 2015. In 2015, the Legislative Council rejects proposals for electing the territory's next leader in 2017, despite pro-democracy protests, and the plans remain unchanged from those by China in 2014. So it's kind of like there's this battle of the people want, democratic elections. The Hong Kong government's like, hey, like we really shouldn't have elections right now because this is like just too screwed up of a system for it to work. And China has already said what it wants to do. So there's just kind of like this trifecta of opposing sides. Let's see. By 2016, in August, hundreds of protesters rally against the disqualification of 6 pro-independence candidates from the Legislative Council elections. And in November, thousands gather in protest of China's intervention after Beijing moved to remove 2 pro-independence legislators. And in November, the High Court disqualifies 2 pro-independence legislators from taking their seats in the Legislative Council after they refused to pledge allegiance to China during a swearing-in ceremony. So just in this year alone, there's so much interference from Beijing on their kind of democratic system, their democracy. They're completely deciding whether or not people can stay in office or even get into office. There's just a lot of interference. By 2017, Chinese President Xi Jinping visits Hong Kong to swear in Chief Executive Carrie Lam, who is the current Chief Executive, and uses his visit to warn her against any attempt to undermine China's influence over the Special Administration region. So essentially, he went over there, they smile and take pictures, and then, whispers in her ear, if you screw this up, we're going to mess you up, essentially. Kind of an not extortion, but it was a fear.
The only reason they show happy smiles out in the open, daggers to the back.
Yeah, except she doesn't get a dagger. I thought that was a really ballsy move on the Chinese premier's part. I mean, just to go over there and so blatantly, scare tactic kind of move on her. Like, that's just crazy. And so that brings us up to the present day. So for those of you watching, this is the end of this video, and thus will begin part 2.